Let us now do a quick summary of this reading. The first thing that you need to know is the classification of regulations and regulators. Now understand that there is this entity or entities called legislative bodies. Legislative bodies define the legislation, define the laws. The laws are sometimes called statutes. In a country, in the United States, for example, the legislative entity would be the Congress. In other countries, the legislative entity might be called something different, but these are the entities that define and create the legislation. An important legislation in the financial industry was the Dodd-Frank Act in the United States, and this reading keeps mentioning that regulation. So the legislative bodies enact laws or statutes. So the regulatory bodies then essentially make sure that the regulation is implemented and followed, right? So with regulatory bodies, you need to recognize that they can either be government agencies. So in a given country, let's say you have an entity called the SEC. Okay, in some countries that might actually be a government entity, or it might be a independent regulator. So it might be a non-government entity. So in order to make sure that it's not politically biased in any way, the regulator can be a non-government entity. But the government needs to give this entity the authority to regulate. If the authority to regulate is not given, then obviously it cannot carry out its function. So to be considered a regulator, it needs to have official authority from the government. An important concept that is discussed in the curriculum in this reading is self-regulating organizations. So what is a self-regulating organization? This falls within the category of independent regulator. So actually here I should say government agency, or we can say independent regulator. The non-government is actually called independent regulator. Now, within this category of independent regulators, we can have entities called self-regulating organizations. A self-regulating organization is one which represents a given industry and also regulates that industry. Now, to carry out a function of a regulator, again, this entity needs to be given the authority by the government. If you simply say that a given organization is a SRO, some SROs have the authority to enforce rules and others do not. The curriculum gives several examples. One of the most commonly used examples is an organization called FINRA. This is in the United States. The mission of this SRO is to protect American investors by making sure that security industry operates fairly and honestly. So that is the mandate of this particular entity. Now the government has given this SRO the authority to enforce laws. So this can be considered a regulator. There are other entities which are SROs, which might not have the authority to enforce laws, so they would not be considered a regulator. You might have an organization which just provides best practices. So you would have an entity which advises regulators in different parts of the world. So it creates rules, regulations, but does not enforce them. It just suggests best practices. So they would also fall within the SRO spectrum, but they would not be regulators. What is the economic rationale of regulation? There are two important factors to consider here, and this connects with something we saw in an earlier reading. We've talked about the fact that sometimes there will be products or services which have a high degree of externalities. And regulation helps ensure that products or services where there is a high degree of benefit to society or to a given industry, then the government regulation needs to be such that the particular activity or product is promoted or subsidized. The other item is informational frictions. If you think about the financial industry, without regulation, there will be scenarios where some groups have more information than other groups. There needs to be regulation that helps ensure that there is a fair playing ground, in the sense that if you think about regulations that require companies which list on the stock exchange to share a certain amount of information. Without that regulation, companies would not share the information with investors. So when companies do not share, or when there is information that is present with some but not with others, that's called informational friction. What would a regulator want to do? A regulator would want to put in rules and regulations that minimize that informational friction. Right. So remember the two factors here. One is related to externalities and the other is related to informational friction. Next point has to do with regulatory interdependence. Now, the point here is that a regulator depends on the industry and the industry depends on the regulator. So regulators do not operate in a vacuum. There is a theory called the regulatory capture theory, which claims that ultimately the regulator starts operating in the best interest of the industry that it is regulating, rather than in the best interest of the consumer or customer or society. So that is a theory of regulatory capture. Whether it is true or not, that is debatable, but that is what this particular theory says. Another theory or a point of view is that there is regulatory competition, that different regulators will all try to compete with each other in order to provide the most business-friendly regulatory environment. Now, what does this mean? I'll give you a very basic example. If you take a given country, and let's say the country is divided into states or provinces, let's say that regulation happens on a per province basis. Every province will try to encourage businesses to come to their particular province. So what will the regulators do? They will try to make rules, regulations that are friendly to the business as opposed to the consumers or society at large, right? So what is that called? That is called regulatory competition. I gave you a simplistic example, but I'm sure there are other examples. What you need to do from an exam perspective is recognize both these terms. Regulatory capture, which says that effectively the industry captures the regulator, and regulatory competition, which means that potentially there is a competition between regulators. The next point has to do with regulatory tools. So what are the tools at the disposal of a regulator? If you think about it, things like taxes, tariffs, subsidies, these are all tools used by the regulator to set a certain price. A regulator might restrict certain activities. For example, in some countries, the securities regulator might prohibit short selling to discourage a certain sort of activity. So these are examples. In the banking industry, in order to protect consumers, there might be rules that say that every bank needs to maintain a certain amount of capital. So there are rules around capital adequacy. So all these are defined and then implemented by regulators. You need to recognize the overall principle. The general principle behind regulation and regulatory tools is to maintain a stable regulatory environment. Regulations should be predictable, effective, consistent, and enforceable. So remember all these things. If you have regulation that is not predictable, what does that do to the business environment? It definitely hurts the environment. So make sure you remember these terms. Stable, and I'll just write these down. So the environment needs to be stable. The regulation should be predictable. It should be effective. No point having regulation that is not having the desired effect. It should be consistent and it should be enforceable. So remember these terms. These are the general principles. Next point. What is the purpose of regulating commerce and financial markets? So let's take commerce first. That's easier. If you think about it, regulation of commerce markets refers to basically regulation of companies. What does the regulator want? There will be laws around protecting consumers. So clearly there will be an issue with companies producing products that are harmful to consumers. So you want to protect consumers, you want to protect labor. So regulations like OSHA in the United States require that companies have a certain level of health and safety in their environments. There needs to be regulation around pollution. So all those are commerce related. Then you have financial markets, which is important for us as financial analysts. I would say that the biggest objective of regulation in financial markets is to protect investors, especially retail investors, smaller investors, because the last thing you want is people putting their retirement money in mutual funds, effectively investing in companies. And if these companies are not acting in a proper way, then obviously your small investor, your retail investor will suffer. So that is the major objective. But then other objectives which link with things that we've seen at level 1. One is to maintain the integrity of financial markets. You want to mitigate agency problems that we've seen before. The regulator will want financial stability. Again, the larger purpose of financial stability is that it's one of the factors that enables growth. So those are the purposes of regulation in financial markets. Moving on, what are the anti-competitive behaviors targeted by antitrust laws? In our area, we are often evaluating companies that are either going to acquire or might be acquired. So mergers and acquisitions. Now, we as financial analysts need to understand that a regulator generally wants a high degree of competition. Because as you saw at level 1, when there is high degree of competition in a society, then the price and the output level is optimal. If you have companies that have too much power and you have an industry that is moving towards a monopoly, what happens? Prices are higher than they should be and output is less than what it should be. So who benefits? The company, the powerful company, and who suffers? Consumers or society. So what do antitrust laws try to do? These laws try to ensure that you don't have companies that are too powerful. Right? So what is the anti-competitive behavior that is targeted? The anti-competitive behavior that is targeted is large players combining to become even larger and even more powerful. So how does that connect with antitrust risk? You as an analyst and potential investor want to put your money in a given company because you think that this company will be acquired by another and the collective entity will be able to sell their product at a much higher price and make lots of money and the share price might go up. But your analysis would be incomplete if you do not consider the potential impact of regulation. And again, if you remember level 1 economics, you spent a fair amount of time dealing with things like the Herfindahl-Hirschman index, which measures the level of competition or concentration. Why do you as an analyst need to understand that? Because you need to know that a regulator will act if the concentration becomes more than a certain amount, or if the concentration of an industry changes more than a certain amount. So the risk of that happening is antitrust risk. Okay, and just remember the fact that what is antitrust laws? Antitrust laws are laws that try to limit the monopolization of a given industry. Benefits and costs of regulation. This is not a huge area, but the point is this. when you are evaluating the regulation in a given country, will the regulation result in certain costs for companies that are being regulated? Obviously. So those costs are referred to as the regulatory burden. So remember that term. Regulatory burden is the private cost that is faced by the companies or the industries that are being regulated. So there is a cost which is called the regulatory burden. There is also a benefit of regulation, which is why regulation is enacted. So that is the benefit. Then there is this other term which is called the net regulatory burden. What is the net regulatory burden? It is the regulatory burden minus the benefit. So this difference is called the net regulatory burden. What the curriculum points out is that it is easy to talk about benefits and costs, but these benefits and costs are very hard to quantify. And also, very often there is regulation, but the impact of the regulation is often not what is desired. For example, a company, in a given country, there might be regulation that says that cars must be fuel efficient. What is the intent? The intent is to reduce the amount of pollution. So fuel efficient, and maybe there are rules around, emission laws. In a state like California, the emission laws are very strict that every car is tested and emission needs to be below a certain level. So the regulation might be to reduce emissions and to improve the environment. But then what is an unintended consequence? People might drive more. Right? So actually this connects better with fuel efficiency. So fuel efficiency might be that people drive, so use less gasoline, but then people might just drive more. So the point is that regulation might not have the desired effect. That is something to keep in mind. That is why whenever regulation is enacted, there will always be a clause which says that this is in effect for a certain amount of period, let's say 1 year or 5 years, and then after 5 years there is an evaluation as to whether the regulation had the desired result or not. And finally, you as an analyst need to evaluate the effect of a particular regulation on an industry, a company, and a security. Because why are you studying this as financial analysts? You need to recognize that if a certain regulation will be enacted, what will be the impact on the industry? Let's say you are a tobacco industry analyst and you observe that some regulation is being discussed which will increase the level of taxes or further reduce the level of advertising that can happen. So that will impact the overall industry. There might be other regulation that might have an impact on a particular company. And then finally, there might be regulation that can impact the security. If you are an equity analyst, then generally company and security are similar. But as a fixed income analyst, a given company can obviously have several fixed income securities. There might be some regulations that have a particular impact on a security. Don't need to get into too much detail here, but just recognize that you need to cover all levels when you are evaluating the impact of regulation. So that's it in terms of this particular reading. As always, go over the summary. There's only one example, unfortunately, so just make sure you do that. Study the learning outcomes. There is only one practice problem, so do that and try to do practice problems from other sources. This is the smallest reading in economics. Doesn't mean that it's not important. You need to at least know the important points. That is it.